Good morning, everyone. This is Alexis Fernandez at CDSS, CalFresh Policy. Thank you for joining today's webinar, particularly with such late notice. We have more than 200 people on the line, so we were glad that we were able to make this work for so many of you. Before we get started, I just want to hit a couple of logistical items here. The webinar will be recorded. Slides and a link to the recording will be posted as soon as possible. And all participants are in listen-only mode. So throughout the presentation, if you do have questions, please submit those through the question box. We'll be addressing them at the end of the presentation. And if we don't get to all of them, many of you are also signed up for tomorrow's Q&A session, so we will be addressing them there or following up via email. So we will make sure to get your questions answered. Okay. I'm now going to hand it off to Kim, who's going to go ahead and get us started, and then we'll dive into the agenda for today's call.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you for so many of you for responding to the invitation and, more importantly, responding to the people of California who need our assistance and to our fellow counties who need our support. As you all know all too well, there have been these terrible fires that directly impacted 7 counties, but of course impacted a much larger region where people live and work and have been evacuated to. And there, as we told you at this time last week, there have been a series of responses from the counties, from CDSS and FNF to make sure that we had some immediate response with our current CalFresh participants. Today's call is to talk about specifically disaster CalFresh, which was approved by FNF late Friday. And an ACWDL is coming to you as we speak. We expect to have it posted during this call on the website. And if for any reason it's not, we will circulate it at the end of the call as an email as part of the materials from the call and get it posted as soon as we can. But what that ACWDL covers is going to be covered exactly in this webinar. So you're going to hear it in the PowerPoint. And it is, in many ways, the disaster CalFresh that we are coming to know from our Lake and Calaveras ran this program when the fires were there 2 years ago. But there is something new that we are doing to really maximize California's strengths in terms of access to people wherever they may be and ensuring accuracy in delivering those benefits. So what we're doing new this time, thanks to the partnership of the 7 counties and our consortia partners at CalWIN and C4, is we are going to be able to serve people wherever they are in the state if they have been displaced because of the fire, because of a job loss, because of an evacuation, because of a home loss. We are going to be able to serve them with CalFresh by working in partnership with the 7 counties who have authority to do so. So that's what's new and why it's so important to have all the counties participating in this call so that we're all clear on the policy, even as the 7 counties are the ones authorized to run CalFresh, because all counties are going to play an important role in assisting those 7 counties with displaced people. And of course, in many ways, this is an important thing for everyone to train on and be up to speed on if indeed you were operating disaster CalFresh, which we never hope, but it may come to you, and this is a good practice for you to make sure your policy and operations are strong. So we are going to focus today on the policy of CalFresh. Later today, there's a call for the operational. We have set up a system of disaster points of contact for each county. All of you should know who your disaster point of contact is, and those disaster point of contact will be trained this afternoon, also by webinar. And then there is another webinar for our outreach partners who are working so hard in the 7 counties in English and Spanish to get the word out about disaster CalFresh. But today, let's start the day by focusing on the policy guidance and the new statewide approach to serving all people in need. I'll turn it over to Alexis to take us through that.
Great, thanks, Kim. So today's agenda will include quite a few topics. We're going to start with an overview of disaster CalFresh and what it is. We're going to talk about the CalFresh application and benefit period. We're going to go over the difference between disaster CalFresh and supplemental CalFresh benefits. We're going to walk through the basics of household composition, eligibility, and verification, and then we'll open a line for questions and answers. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with what is disaster CalFresh. Many of you are quite familiar, but I just want to make sure we're starting on the same page. CalFresh provides temporary food assistance for households affected by natural disaster. It provides 1 month of benefits for eligible Californians at the maximum allotment, and it can facilitate the issuance of supplemental CalFresh benefits for ongoing households. Supplemental benefits, which we're going to talk about in depth in the next couple of slides, bring our ongoing CalFresh caseload to the max allotment for parity with new CalFresh applicants. An affected area must have received a presidential declaration of major disaster with individual assistance in order to request to operate CalFresh. The 7 counties in which we will be operating this coming week have all received that major disaster declaration. CalFresh timing varies with the unique circumstances of each disaster, but always begins when commercial channels of food distribution have been restored and families are able to purchase and prepare food. So we believe in the 7 counties that that is available to folks, and will begin operating this coming Wednesday. This week, October 25th. Which brings me to my next point. So the CalFresh application period. CWDs may accept disaster CalFresh applications for new households and request for supplements for ongoing households only during the disaster CalFresh application period. Let's walk through the approved application periods for this coming week. In Butte, Lake, Mendocino, Napa, Nevada, and Yuba counties, the application period will begin on Wednesday, October 25th. It goes through Saturday the 28th, so we're not operational on Sunday. And we start again on Monday, October 29th through Wednesday, November 1st. So this 7-day application period is non-consecutive. So again, we will not be operating on Sunday in those 6 counties. In Sonoma County, we've been approved for an 8-day consecutive application period, Wednesday, October 25th through Wednesday, November 1. And this difference really reflects the extensive impact that Sonoma County sustained in the wildfires. In addition to the CalFresh application period, California has been approved for pre-registration, which allows households to submit some of the required CalFresh application information in advance. The applicant must then appear at the CalFresh application site for the interview and the collection of required verifications. We're going to talk more about that. Only the wildfire impacted counties will be conducting CalFresh pre-registration. All right, so in addition to the approved application period, we also have a unique disaster CalFresh concept called the benefit period. The benefit period, which is always 30 days, is a period during which disaster-related expenses may be counted and the start date used to determine household composition and resources. So only income, resources, and expenses that are incurred during the benefit period are considered when we determine CalFresh eligibility, or rather, disaster CalFresh eligibility. In a few slides, we'll discuss how to calculate the disaster gross income limit, or DGIL, to determine eligibility. The DGIL takes the income, expenses, and resources available to the household during the benefit period into consideration to determine eligibility. All right, so I briefly mentioned at the start of the slideshow that households or ongoing households may apply for supplemental benefits during the application period. Before we get into the details of determining disaster CalFresh eligibility, I want to spend a few minutes discussing supplements, just so that we're all on the same page. Supplements bring ongoing CalFresh households impacted by the disaster up to the maximum allotment. This is done for parity with CalFresh households, the new applicants, and is done because by virtue of their participation in CalFresh, we know the food needs of those households. The impact of any disaster-related expense will weigh heavily on our ongoing CalFresh household population. Therefore, supplements are the option for serving those ongoing households. A couple of important things to highlight. When issuing supplements to an ongoing CalFresh household, the household does not need to appear in person and does not need to complete the face-to-face interview. All right, there are 2 types of supplements, individual and automatic. For California's waiver approval, we will be employing both options during the application period. Individual supplements will be issued based on household request, and automatic supplements will be issued based on zip code level power outage and mandatory evacuation data. This data indicates that a majority of households in the particular zip codes were impacted by the disaster. We know that by having an extensive power outage or mandatory evacuation, those households in particular were affected by the disaster, and the data is the indication of that impact. The zip codes that will be receiving automatic supplements are included in the state's CalFresh approval, so you can go ahead and reference that approval to take a look at the zip codes that will be receiving automatic supplements. And they will be issued as soon as possible to reduce the burden of having folks walking into the office. Before I get to the details of processing an individual request, I do want to make one important note, and that is that household members who had been excluded from the CalFresh household at the time of the disaster, such as an SSI recipient or an ineligible student, may be eligible for disaster CalFresh, but must complete the full application process. Excluded members cannot be added to the ongoing CalFresh household when a supplement is issued. That applies whether it's issued individually or on an automatic basis. So an ongoing household can receive the supplemental CalFresh benefit that brings them up to the max and can complete a disaster CalFresh application to receive disaster CalFresh benefits for an excluded member. Let's talk a bit about how we issue individual requests for supplements. In order to make a request for supplements, an ongoing CalFresh household must complete either the CS385, which is the CalFresh application, the CS303, which was recently updated to include a supplement section, or an equivalent affidavit form. There is a sample in the guidance that we linked to in our original email and which we will be communicating to folks who registered late this morning. So long as the initial request for supplements is made during the application period, an affidavit can be accepted in person, online, over the phone, or by mail. If the request is made over the phone and the form must be sent to the client for signature, the CWD must provide the client 10 days to return the form. In these cases, the supplement may be processed outside of the application period if delayed due to the addition of the 10 days to turn around the signature. And then just a note here, confirming for folks that the wildfire impacted counties who have the electronic signature option can use that electronic signature to complete this form, which is a great way to complete the supplement request over the phone in a very timely manner. So definitely consider using that if it's available in your disaster CalFresh county. Okay, so leaving supplemental benefits behind, we're going to get into the details of disaster CalFresh for new applicant households. Let's start with the definition of a household for the purposes of determining CalFresh eligibility. First, we determine household composition as of the date of the disaster. In this case, the date of the disaster is October 8th. As of that date, the CalFresh household includes people who live and eat together, a concept we're very familiar with. That said, a couple of important distinctions need to be made. The disaster CalFresh household does not include people with whom the applicant is temporarily staying with during the disaster. And the disaster CalFresh household may include individuals who had previously been excluded from the CalFresh household at the time of the disaster. So again, an example of this is an SSI recipient, ineligible student. There are others as well, excluded categories. If they were excluded from a CalFresh household at the time of the disaster, they may apply for CalFresh if they meet the eligibility criteria on their own. They must complete the full CalFresh application, including the interview and the provision of required verifications. All right, now that we've defined the household, let's talk about the application. Disaster CalFresh has its own application, the CS385. It is available in both Spanish and English and other threshold languages depending on the county. This disaster CalFresh application can be completed online or in person during the CalFresh application period, but it will not be accepted via mail due to the limited length of the application period. So again, I think this is an important point, so I'm going to repeat myself. We can accept the CalFresh application online or in person, but we will not be accepting the CalFresh application via mail. Similarly to the request or supplemental benefits, the CalFresh application may be signed using electronic signature, but the client must appear for face-to-face interview and to provide the required verifications. So even if the application itself is completed online or over the phone, depending on the call center model you all have with electronic signature, that client still needs to come in for the face-to-face interview and to provide required verifications. Once the application is complete, eligibility staff must determine whether the household is eligible for disaster CalFresh benefits. While there are some overlapping concepts with determining regular CalFresh eligibility, while there are some concepts with determining regular CalFresh eligibility, the CalFresh eligibility determination is unique, so we are going to spend a few minutes discussing those unique factors. Let's start with the basic eligibility criteria, which are 3. First, the CalFresh applicant must have lived or worked in the disaster area at the time of the disaster. In this case, the disaster area is one of the 7 counties. Second, the CalFresh applicant must plan to purchase food during the benefit period. For the majority of cases, this is going to be a yes. They're planning to purchase food in the benefit period. Keep in mind that this criteria speaks only to plans to purchase food in the benefit period. It does not mean that the CalFresh benefits have to be used in the benefit period. Rather, really focuses on the plan to purchase over those 30 days. Lastly, the CalFresh applicant must have experienced an adverse effect due to the disaster. We're going to discuss the definition of adverse effects on the next slide. In addition to the 3 basic criteria, the household must also meet the CalFresh income limit, which I mentioned earlier, and it's called the Disaster Gross Income Limit, DGIL. We will also be diving into how to determine the DGIL in just a minute, but I do want to highlight that the fiscal year 2018 income limits and household allotments were released via ACL I-6117 on September 20th, 2017. So those are available online. All right, so now we're going to dive into the 3 criteria, and I have to say that I think residency and the plan to purchase food are easily understood. The household, in terms of residency, the household must have lived or worked in the disaster area. We're going to be talking about what verification will be required in, later in the slideshow. And the plan to purchase food, again, must be in the benefit period, October 8th through November 7th, 2017. What I want to spend a little bit more time on is the definition of adverse effects. Adverse effects fall into 3 categories: loss of income, inaccessible resources, and disaster expenses. So the first, loss of income, will be relatively common. If the household has experienced job loss, the temporary closure of a place of employment, or if they're self-employed and were not able to work during the benefit period, this would count as a loss of income. Inaccessible liquid resources, for example, if a bank is closed due to the disaster, will be less common since most households will have access to the banking system during the disaster. The third, disaster expenses, we believe will be the most common. These include out-of-pocket expenses paid, not only incurred, but paid by the household during the 30-day benefit period. And these are expenses that the household does not expect to be reimbursed during that 30-day period. And in a few minutes, we'll go into detail about what types of expenses you'll consider when deducting the amount of those expenses from the disaster gross income limit. Okay, The disaster gross income limit. As mentioned, if a household meets the 3 basic eligibility criteria, the household must also meet the CalFresh income limit or the disaster gross income limit. The DGL groups income and resources under one test. So this is a little different than what we're used to under regular CalFresh. Under regular CalFresh, we distinguish between income and resources. They each have their own tests. The DGL groups both income and resources under a single test. At a high level, the DGIL is determined by calculating the household's take-home income received or expected to be received during the benefit period, plus accessible liquid resources, so cash on hand, money and savings accounts, minus the disaster-related expenses. Here's a visual, just because I know that's quite a bit to take in. We'll go through this one more time. So the DGIL is your total take-home income, and again, this applies during the 30-day benefit period, plus your accessible liquid resources, so the cash that you have on hand, the cash that you have in your savings or checking accounts, minus deductible disaster-related expenses. And we're going to talk about what those expenses include. But you have to, the household, in order to be eligible, has to have those 3 items less than or equal to the disaster gross income limit. Okay. So before I jump into this, we'll take a minute again to reiterate that income is total take-home pay of the household members during the benefit period, and accessible liquid resources are cash on hand and funds accessible the first day, and I just caught a little typo on my slide, the first day of the disaster benefit period. Where I want to spend most of the time for this discussion is on disaster expenses that a household has paid or expects to pay out of pocket during the disaster benefit period. So a couple of notes on deductible disaster-related expenses. If the household has received or anticipates receiving a reimbursement for these expenses during the disaster period, so during the 30-day disaster period, only the net expense is deductible. If deductible expenses do not include expenses which have been incurred but will not be paid for within the disaster period, so for example, an expense that was paid by credit card but the bill is due after the benefit period ends, those will not be included in this calculation. Eligible expenses may include some of the following: home or business repairs, temporary shelter expenses, so if you were, for example, evacuated and you needed to stay in a hotel, evacuation expenses, including the cost of the gas that you had to use to evacuate, medical expenses due to personal injury, disaster-related funeral expenses, disaster-related pet boarding fees, expenses related to replacing necessary personal and household items, which we think are going to be quite common. That includes clothing, appliances, or tools that maybe got damaged in the disaster, cleanup item expenses, disaster-damaged vehicle expenses, or food lost or spoiled due to the disaster or extended power outage. This can also be considered a disaster-related expense. When determining the disaster gross income limit, it is recommended that CWDs ask specific questions about the potential loss of income or disaster expense. For example, did the household lose wages? Did you incur any temporary shelter expense? Did you have to replace any personal items such as clothing? It may be difficult for individuals and families impacted by the disaster to recall all deductible expenses, given how stressful the situation is for them. So the more specific questions you ask, the better in terms of understanding what expenses the household did actually incur as a result of a disaster. On this next slide, I pulled an example straight from the Disaster SNAP guidance that is issued by FNS, just to give us a little bit more sense of how the DGL impacts eligibility. So in this example, Joan's car was damaged in the disaster. The total cost of the repair was $700, but Joan's insurance covers $500 of that expense. So her out-of-pocket net expense was $200. In addition, their home was damaged and repairs will cost $3,000 in total. They've paid so far $400 out of pocket. They have not yet received the FEMA assistance or reimbursement from their homeowner's insurance, and they don't think that they're going to get that until after the benefit period ends. They also lost $125 worth of food due to an extended power outage. So in total, the disaster-related expense is the $200 out of pocket that they paid for the car repair, the $400 out of pocket that they paid for the home repairs, and the $125 of food lost, bringing the total to $725. So again, important details here. It is the net expense incurred by the household, and these expenses were all incurred during the benefit period, the 30 days between, in this case, October 8th and November 7th. All right, so to wrap up our discussion on general eligibility, the key eligibility questions to ask yourself when determining CalFresh eligibility. Did the household live or work in the disaster area when the disaster struck? Does the household plan to purchase food during the benefit period? Did the household experience a disaster-related loss of income or a disaster-related expense that will not be reimbursed during the benefit period? And does the household meet the disaster income and resources test, which is known as the disaster gross income limit? All right. We already mentioned this earlier in our presentation, but we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the CalFresh interview. Though the CalFresh interview is short, it is an important component of the application process, as it allows eligibility staff to review potentially confusing topics, such as what exactly may count as a disaster-related expense, and it allows eligibility staff to verify information that was presented on the application. The CalFresh interview must be completed in person. There are only a very, very narrow set of exceptions to this for applicants who are unable to make the in-person interview, but it is, again, very, very narrow. In general, all CalFresh applicants are expected to complete a face-to-face interview. One important note, the date of application submission, not the date of the interview, is considered the application filing date. Given that CalFresh benefits must be issued in 3 days, it is important that the face-to-face interview is completed right away. This is especially important if an applicant has applied online. So we're really encouraging CWDs to reach out right away when an online application or application in general is submitted to schedule the interview and collect required verifications as soon as possible. Okay. Now we're going to get into the Disaster CalFresh verification requirements. So the Disaster CalFresh verification requirements are 3. First, identity must be verified. Second, residency and loss or inaccessibility of income or liquid resources should be verified where possible. And household composition and food loss can be verified if questionable. So important note on identity verification. While it is required, a specific type of documentary proof is not. So this is the same as our existing verification rules for identity today under regular CalFresh. Acceptable identity verification may include, but is not limited to, a driver's license, a work or school ID card, an identification card for health benefits, a voter registration card, a foreign passport, a matricula consulares, or other documentary proof that is available to the household. If documentary proof is not available, for example, if someone had lost their home and doesn't have the verification available to them, identity may be verified through collateral contact. Please note that a Social Security number is not required to apply for CalFresh, so the identity verification requirement should not be confused with an SSN number that is not required to apply. To the extent possible, verification of residency should be accomplished via information for other sources, such as a rent or mortgage billing statement, utility billing statement, and identity documents. No specific type of documentary proof is required for residency either. Since each disaster is unique and the availability of verification will vary from household to household, public information should indicate that applicants are expected to bring all available verification documents. But if required, the CWD will assist households securing necessary verifications, especially if documents have been lost due to the disaster, maybe a home loss or a similar situation. This can include, with the client's permission, verifying information through alternative sources such as online banking or utility accounts, and using collateral contacts when appropriate. So really focused on doing everything that you can to assist the household in acquiring the necessary verifications. All right. In addition to completing the interview and collecting required verifications, all CWDs will screen for duplicate participation before completing the CalFresh eligibility determination. This will be done by referencing the SAWs and meds to determine that the household is not receiving regular CalFresh, that the household has not already been approved for CalFresh during the benefit application period, and that approved and denied CalFresh households do not overlap. Once we've determined eligibility, so the application has been submitted, the interview is complete, verifications have been collected, we've done the duplicate participation check, it's time to issue benefits. Disaster CalFresh provides a full month allotment to households equal to the maximum allotment for their household size. Again, the fiscal year 2018 allotments were released via ACIN I-6117. They're also included on this slide for your reference. Lastly but not least, CalFresh benefits must be issued within 3 days of application and can be issued on a regular EBT card. A special disaster EBT card is only required when the application site conditions constrain access to a printing or a pinning machine. Otherwise, CalFresh benefits are issued on regular EBT cards and within 3 days. Okay. Before we get to the question and answer, I want to highlight the must-read Disaster SNAP guidance released by FNS. This guidance provides a lot more detail regarding CalFresh, including the application and eligibility determination process, as well as general operation of the program. So definitely, this is one of those items that you'll want to keep handy as we implement this coming week, and which provides a really great resource on CalFresh in general. All right. So with that, we're going to open the question and answer session. Please submit your questions through the question box. While that is happening, I'm going to highlight that tomorrow, Tuesday, October 24th, we're also going to host a CalFresh Q&A session with CalFresh policy and operations. So if we don't get to your question today or something comes to mind later this afternoon, join us tomorrow. That'll be an open session, Q&A only. And I think we'll get started with questions from there. Okay. Let me just organize myself. Oh, and before we get started with question and answers, one note, the Disaster CalFresh All County Welfare Directors letter just went live on our website.
To be clear, it is on the county letters page right now. We are going to be moving it also to the Disaster CalFresh page as well. So it is posted under county letters, and check back, you can find it there, and we'll also be moving it to the Disaster CalFresh page shortly.
All right. So let's start with some questions. Where can the DSNAP guidance be found? That can be found on USDA FNS's page. I'll also follow up with a link directly to the document. It was shared this morning for folks who registered earlier in the day. I know there were some last-minute registrations, so that will be coming up. Another couple items on logistics here. The PowerPoint and the recording will be on the Disaster CalFresh webpage. So that's on the CDSS site, and again, we'll follow up with links for folks. Okay. So the question, first question, if a household applies for Disaster CalFresh and then also completes an application for regular CalFresh, will the new CalFresh application be will start on 11/8/17 since participants would have received benefits under DCalFresh through the benefit period? And the answer is yes. So, and this is actually a great point. As you are processing DCalFresh applications, you may also run into folks who will be eligible for regular CalFresh. And what you'll want to do is use that opportunity of engagement to meet their long-term food needs, enroll them in regular CalFresh, and their regular CalFresh benefits will start at the end of the benefit period for Disaster CalFresh. So in this case, the Disaster CalFresh benefit period ends on November 7th. That means that the regular CalFresh benefits can begin on November 8th. All right. So there's a question about what disaster assistance payments are countable. And I'll have to pull up the MPP on this, but most disaster assistance, housing, FEMA payments are excluded from CalFresh income. So they are not included in a regular CalFresh application benefit determination or the DCalFresh benefit determination. We'd have to pull the citation for that. I don't have it off the top of my head, but those are excluded from the eligibility determination. So there's a question here about previously excluded members. So whether all excluded members from the household can apply for DCalFresh, and that is correct. Any category of a excluded member, so anybody who was previously excluded for any reason, IPV, work registration, student ineligibility, there are several that we are familiar with. Anybody who was excluded previously can apply for Disaster CalFresh. Okay, so this question is about the application period and whether counties will be available on Saturday and Sunday during the application period. So we have been working with the wildfire impacted counties, and those 7 counties will be available throughout the application period. It does include Saturdays and a Sunday in Sonoma. The remainder of CWDs statewide will keep their regular business hours. So during the application period, a displaced individual might request DCalFresh in another county, and you are definitely expected to help facilitate that DCalFresh application, but you are not expected to keep your CWDs across the state open on Saturdays and Sundays. So I appreciate the thought. All right, so this is a good question. Are households required to apply for Disaster CalFresh, or do they have the option to apply for regular CalFresh instead? So Disaster CalFresh is definitely optional. I will say that in many cases, the Disaster CalFresh allotment at the maximum is going to be advantageous for households. So again, while it is totally optional, if the household meets the Disaster CalFresh eligibility criteria and would otherwise receive less regular CalFresh benefits, we would recommend having the household apply for Disaster CalFresh, receiving the maximum benefit for the Disaster CalFresh benefit period, and then bringing that household onto regular CalFresh. Of course, it's up to the household how they would like to move forward with their application, but remember, the DCalFresh benefits are at the max allotment for the household size. All right. So a question about whether verification is required for expenses. So the disaster-related expense category is not one of the required verification categories. That said, to the extent that a household is able to verify reasonable disaster-related expenses, they should. If the expense is questionable for whatever reason, for example, it seems extraordinarily high in comparison to other disaster expenses. They're claiming $6 a gallon for gas when you knew that it was $2.50 a gallon for gas. Those questionable expenses can be explored further, and you can request verification as available. In those cases, the application does not need to be processed in the 3-day or under the 3-day requirement. You can take more time with the particular application to ensure that the client's statements are accurate, that their estimate of the disaster-related expenses are accurate to possibly gather some additional information. So it is not a required category, but if they seem unreasonable or questionable, you have some time to explore those expenses. Okay, give me a chance to catch up here. Okay, so here's a good question. If an individual lives in a non-impacted disaster county, however, they work in the impacted disaster county, do they apply for Disaster CalFresh benefits in their county of residence? This sounds a little tricky. So you have, in this scenario, an individual who, let's say, works in or lives in Contra Costa, but worked in Sonoma and was impacted by the Sonoma wildfires. That person may apply for Disaster CalFresh either in Sonoma, directly with Sonoma County, or if they submit their application in Contra Costa, the Contra Costa disaster point of contact will coordinate with Sonoma County to make sure that that person is eligible, or rather, that that person's application is processed and the benefits are issued by Sonoma County. So, like a displaced individual, someone who worked in the impacted county might have a point of entry in their county of residency. All right, and then just a quick question here, again confirming that a Social Security number is not required. Just making sure that that was clear. So again, you are required to verify identity, but a Social Security number is not required for purposes of applying for Disaster CalFresh. Okay. Next question. How will displaced families and individuals know that they can apply for DCalFresh benefits in the county that they are temporarily living in? So just this morning, we have started the kind of community outreach component of our disaster response. So USDA FNS, CDSS, the wildfire impacted counties are launching the public communications campaign. So that message will be getting out to Californians that have been impacted by the fire. Additionally, when the DCalFresh applications are available online, there will be a client-facing message about the availability of benefits. It's pretty prominently placed. So as an individual runs across My Benefits or benefitscal.org, I forget now, I'm sorry, or their local C4 yourself or CalWIN application, they'll be prompted to get linked to the Disaster CalFresh application. So the public engagement piece is definitely big and is getting started as we speak already. All right, so this is a good question around disaster-related expenses. If a household used a credit card to pay for a hotel, so they had to seek temporary shelter, and the billing cycle ends after the disaster period, is the expense not allowed? That is correct. So in general, for disaster-related expenses, the expense not only had to have been incurred during the 30-day benefit period, but it also had to be paid for during the 30-day benefit period. If that household happens to want to pay their credit card bill early, they can. I know that might be difficult for folks, but otherwise, it is not allowed if it was paid after the benefit period. All right. So this is a good question. If a current CalFresh customer is eligible for a supplement to their CalFresh benefits, that is temporarily living in a county that is not a disaster-impacted county, which county will issue the supplement? So the county in which the case is active will issue the supplement. So if it's an ongoing CalFresh household from one of the 7 impacted counties, even if they've been displaced, what we'll ask is that you use the same disaster point of contact process, reach out to the county of residence with the active case, and have the county of residence with the active case complete the supplement. The good thing about a supplement is that it can be done over the phone or by mail, and so the person does not need to return for the face-to-face interview or to collect the required verifications. You simply need to connect with the disaster point of contact to coordinate the issuance from the fire-impacted county. We're going to take a couple more questions, and there are quite a few. So again, if your question is not answered, do not worry. We'll be following up with folks and getting you either answers to your questions during tomorrow's Q&A or in writing as a follow-up to this webinar. All right, let me just organize myself here. Give me a second. All right, so if an applicant decides to stay in an evacuated area, experienced a power outage, and was unable to get to their bank, would this be considered a adverse impact as a result of the fire? So for this particular scenario, if the person experienced a long-term power outage of 4 hours or more, they do have 2 options. Food loss alone can make them eligible for disaster CalFresh. That is an adverse effect due to the disaster. They may also consider requesting replacement benefits for if they are a regular CalFresh household, for food that was already purchased with this month's benefits. The inability to get to their bank is a little bit difficult to judge because most people now have access to online banking or ATMs that are otherwise open. So really the inaccessibility of liquid resources is more often when banks are fully closed. If you have your online banking access, if you have ATMs in the area, it's very rare that the liquid resource would not be accessible. So of course, that determination is made on a case-by-case basis, but it is going to be a rare occurrence in this particular disaster. All right, so this is a good question. So at the beginning of the presentation, we mentioned that regular CalFresh and disaster CalFresh could not be issued at the same time. That is correct. If a household that is ongoing on regular CalFresh lost food due to the disaster, can they receive a supplement? This is actually 2 separate things and is a really important point to highlight. The Supplements under Disaster CalFresh are a given for any existing CalFresh household. If we are operating DCalFresh, any ongoing CalFresh household can request supplemental benefits, and by nature of their being on CalFresh already, we know that the disaster has impacted them adversely. So they simply complete the request and they are given the supplement. That is separate from food loss, which was caused, for example, by a power outage, and a request to receive replacement CalFresh benefits. So if an existing CalFresh household lost food, they can replace benefits for the lost food, and they can receive the supplement to bring them from their regular CalFresh allotment to the maximum. And to be clear, the availability of replacements is not only during an official DCalFresh application period. That is an option we have throughout the year. If an individual has lost food, for example, your refrigerator goes out, there's a long power outage in your community, you can always request replacement benefits. And you can do that in addition to receiving a supplement. And they're actually on the same form. So it's definitely something to explore with clients who've experienced power loss, especially. All right. I think with so many questions here that we're going to take the rest of these questions offline, and we're going to address them either tomorrow during the Q&A or in writing so that we can get you those questions as timely as possible. For today, just want to reiterate that the recording and the slides will be available online, and we'll be getting together tomorrow for the Q&A session at 11:15. Come ready. If you want to send us your questions in advance, you can do that either to myself, Alexis Fernandez at dss.ca.gov, or to Frank Verdusto, and we will start organizing all our information for tomorrow's Q&A. All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us on such short notice. We appreciate all the questions, and again, I think we'll talk to many of you later today on one of our other webinars as well. So thanks and have a great day.